We are studying the Heckscher-Ohlin model, and we are solving the model for the home country under autarky. From before, we already know how a change in relative price of the goods are going to influence the factor prices, and how changes in factor price ratio is going to affect the land by labor ratio. But what we do not know is how are these resources allocated between the two sectors. And we've also haven't incorporated this constraint that the amount of labor that you use in the cloth and the food sector has to be equal to the amount of resources that you own. Yeah? That is true for both labor and land. So let's go back to the production graphs. First graph on the right hand side. Cloth, 2 meters of cloth can be produced either by using 3 units of land and 4 units of labor, or by using 5 units of land and 3 units of labor. Yeah? So producers can change the amount of land to labor ratio that they're using depending upon what happens to the factor prices. Now, as you move away from this origin, there's an increase in output that is produced of cloth, right? Because you are using more of the two inputs, and hence there would be an increase in the output for cloth. Now, when there's a change in land by labor ratio, that is going to be a move in this graph. What is the slope of this line? Well, it would be the new land by labor ratio that the cloth sector is now using. And the same thing applies to the food production as well. So we haven't incorporated our constraints. Now, the production process for the cloth sector, we are measuring labor in the cloth sector and land in the cloth sector. All right, so one way of incorporating this constraint in this model is, well, how about instead of just measuring labor that is used in the cloth sector on this axis, we actually extend this and measure the total labor supply in this economy. Yeah? And similarly for the land, we extend this, and the y-axis, we measure the total amount of land that exists in this country, home country. Yeah? So what we're going to do is we're going to build in these constraints, resource constraint, into the model and create a box which measures the amount of resources that this country has. Okay? So the x-axis can measure the total amount of labor supply that exists in this economy, and the y-axis can measure land that is used in the economy. And if we measure the amount of labor used in the cloth sector from this axis, whatever is left over would be the amount that is used in the food sector. So the box is measuring the amount of resources that the country has. So keep that in mind. We are going to move or shift this graph such that it overlaps on the first graph and creates a box which is equal to the resource constraints. Okay. Let's do that. All right. So the total labor supply is being measured on this axis. Total amount of land is being measured on the y-axis. If this is the amount of labor used in the cloth sector, then whatever is left over is going to be used in the food sector. So what do we have here? We have origin of cloth. As you move away from the origin of cloth, you're producing more cloth. We have the origin of food on this side. And as you move away from the origin of food, you're allocating more resources to the food sector and hence producing more food output. All right, so we've created this box, and sometimes this is referred to as the Edgeworth box. Labor endowment is being measured on the x-axis, and land endowments are being measured on the y-axis. From this left-hand side, as we move further away, we measure the amount of labor that is allocated to the cloth sector, and whatever is left is going to be the amount used in the food sector. Now, if you remember, this was our CC line, which was the land by labor ratio that was being used in the cloth sector. Yeah? And as the price of cloth changes, as W bar R changes, our T by L ratios change in both the sector. Yeah? Let's assume that the land by labor ratio was 2 to begin with. Yeah? When these things change, the land by labor ratio for the cloth sector changed from 2 to 3. Yeah? Slope is going to now increase because there's an increase in T by L ratio from 2 to 3. And this is your new land by labor ratio in the cloth sector. Okay, a change in the land by labor ratio is going to be shown by a change or a shift in these lines. Yeah, and if there's an increase in land by labor ratio, this line moves towards the land axis. If it becomes less land intensive and more labor intensive, it's going to move towards the labor axis. Same thing for the food sector as well. Okay. So let's look at one such example. Suppose this was our cloth line. This is the T by L ratio that is used in the cloth sector. We also know T by L ratio that the food sector uses. And so for the home country, the equilibrium point is where both optimum land by labor ratios have been achieved at the equilibrium point, point 1. And this would tell us how much labor is being used in the cloth sector and how much labor is being allocated to the food sector. Yeah? And the two will add up to total labor supply in the economy. Yeah? Similarly, we would also know how much land is being used in the cloth sector and how much is being used in the food sector. Yeah? We have our resource allocations.